So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are checking in from today. Welcome to the first event of the series in the new year. It appears that we are turning a corner with the new administration and the arrival of the vaccine, and I have real hope in my heart. And who's with me? You want to put a message on the chat? Is everybody hopeful? Oh, hey Shane, good to meet you. Good to have you here. So my name is Lata Poonamali. I'm the chair of management faculty at the New School, and I curate and host the Management and Social Justice Conversation series. As some of you repeat attendees know, this series creates a space for people who wish to reimagine organizations and management as vehicles of social justice, equity, and inclusion. We look at different types of organizations from various sectors, including public, private, nonprofit, social ventures, and social movements. And last semester, we hosted 12 events featuring insightful research and dynamic speakers. And I guarantee that this semester's events will be equally riveting. On that note, I want to remind you that we are also inviting submissions of papers and proposals to be featured in the second series that will start in fall 2021. And all scholarly papers will be peer-reviewed and provided opportunities for journal publications and book chapters. And we also invite proposals for panels featuring practitioners and workshops. And our fall 21 series will start with a focus on higher ed institutions as vehicles for social justice and inclusion. And the New School's President McBride, will kick off the series with welcome remarks, and we have a electric panel actually. And in fall 2021, we also expect to launch a brand new undergraduate program that will focus on global and collective well-being as the end goal of management and organizations, while helping students develop much needed skills in management and entrepreneurship for effective production and delivery of goods, services, ideas, and innovations. We are also in the final stages of developing a new graduate program in management and organizational leadership with the core of just and inclusive organizations. And these new programs will embody the New School's take on management and scholarship and education that centers social justice, inclusion, and equity as key goals. And as we all know, job losses due to the pandemic have disproportionately affected minorities, women, and low-wage workers. The COVID-19 pandemic, like every other disaster, once again reveals to us the deep economic divides in this country and elsewhere, and the unrelenting burden the least privileged among us carry for the rest of us. So no, we are not all in it together. Impact of COVID-19 affects folks differently based on zip code. Recession has almost ended for high-wage workers, while low-wage jobs continue to be lost. Economic recovery from the pandemic is crucial for all other social and public health outcomes as well. In this country and across the world, entrepreneurship is an important vehicle for moving individuals out of unemployment and poverty. However, entrepreneurship becomes more than just that when new ventures are created by people from marginalized and underserved communities. It stimulates agency, it provides autonomy, and the ability to serve their own communities whose needs go unaddressed by most mainstream businesses. But we also know the statistics. A minuscule proportion of the venture capital funds go to enterprises founded by women and underrepresented minorities. And I want to give props here to the Impact Entrepreneurship Program at the New School that provides scholarship and great learning opportunities to students who are marginalized in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, and to also our panel who are doing great work in this space. So resilience in human and living systems is not just about bouncing back to as it were. It is about building back better in a more sustainable way, environmentally, socially, and economically, as we must be and we can be. And this panel will explore how the city can engage in a more inclusive economic and social recovery and rejuvenation through the collective power of minority entrepreneurship. I am thrilled to welcome the panelists and today's panel facilitator, Raymond Daniel Medina. Ray is Assistant Director in the New York City Mayor's Office of the Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprises. He's also a proud graduate student in our organizational change management program. And so a couple of housekeeping remarks. This session is recorded and it will be shared informally through my YouTube channel, and will be shared with all the attendees and those who RSVP to attend the program. And please use the chat option for talking with the panelists and among each other, but use the Q&A because that we will closely monitor for posing questions to the panelists. So as we all know, our city is probably the most diverse one on the planet, and what happens here can influence the rest of the world. So let's get to work. Over to you, Ray. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Latha, so much for the kind introduction and the wonderful opportunity to speak with this panel of thinkers and doers. Before we meet them and discuss the role of minority business enterprises in rebuilding New York City post-COVID, I wanted to share a few thoughts coming out of some of our earlier conversations that I believe will help to center this one. With appreciation for Black History Month, this panel is composed of Black and Indigenous people of color identifying entrepreneurs. I'll use the term BIPOC going forward. We fully acknowledge and honor that minority business enterprise programs are generally more expansive definitionally and actively, and that the city's own program is composed of, in addition, Asian and Native American business owners and who are also identified as minorities. The entrepreneurial experience of an LGBTQ, minority, woman, and/or immigrant entrepreneur, as well as that of a straight white male citizen-owned business, and other categorical intersections I haven't named here, all offer unique and important lenses, which together help us to bring the big picture and the fine details into equal focus. While many of those groups of people are not represented on this panel or in this discussion, our conversations have been, and I trust will continue to be sensitive to the intersectionality that informs the lived experience of every entrepreneur. As we move into the Q&A portion of today's events, we'll welcome questions and feedback from our audience participants who might want to share the experience, structural barriers, and resources that inform your orientation during this critical period in the city's history. We're especially curious to learn how you see your role in its future. We do have a quick poll, which we'd like to take, which I'd ask for our organizers, our hosts' help in administering. If you can just let us know a little bit about yourself, that would be really helpful as we frame the conversation going forward. I want to further thank Latha and the New School for offering this important series free of charge and creating the opportunity for all of us to keep our attention on social justice issues beyond the spotlights of last year. It's so important to maintain attention and invest in change, to look critically at some of the systemic issues that manifest in acute expressions like police violence or voter disenfranchisement. I'd like to ground today's conversation in the intertwined and synergistic relationship between capitalism and more recently neoliberalism and the co-optation of people by race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. Really, after 40 years of neoliberalism, Black and Hispanic families now have less intergenerational wealth compared to white families than they did at the end of the civil rights era 50 years ago. According to the Pew Research Center, among lower and middle income households, white families have 4 times as much wealth as Black families and 3 times as much as Hispanic families. And while large national and multinational corporations have had greatest access to federal support, further benefited by recent and significant tax cuts, some estimates indicate that as many as 40% of Black-owned businesses across the country will shutter as a result of the current economic crisis. Considering the extent to which these businesses represent intergenerational wealth, local investment, and employment opportunities, this outlook represents a national emergency and a city emergency. This isn't a theoretical conversation we're about to have. This is a now conversation. On a somewhat brighter note, we are the consumers. We are the taxpayers, the voters, the workers, and the owners who can choose to either support or subvert the system, who can take back the story. And as we move through the next hour, looking at the role of MBEs in rebuilding New York City post-COVID, we'll look at where beliefs, choices, and changes can come together to represent a fairer tomorrow for New York City businesses, our organizations, and nonprofit and social entrepreneurship in our communities. I personally come from a family of entrepreneurs. I'm looking at the poll here as well. and seeing that we have a really good mix of folks who have tuned in. I personally come from a family of entrepreneurs and appreciate the impact one person or one business can have, as well as the hard work and resilience it takes to make a business work. I was drawn to my work in the Mayor's Office of Minority Women-Owned Business Enterprises by the opportunity to explore and develop policy, program, and process changes that help people in and outside of the city agencies to imagine and realize a more equitable and just economy. I like to think of myself as an entrepreneur, and very grateful to the New School for the organizational change management program, which I believe is helping me to do that. I'm joined here today by a range of entrepreneurs and subject matter experts to discuss the lived experience of BIPOC MBEs in for-profit, nonprofit, and systemic economic contexts. I've been privileged to have some great conversations with them so far, and honored to introduce them to you now. In alphabetical order today, you'll hear, at least with this first question, from Rachel Marie Brooks Atkins, Esmeralda Herrera, Noelle McKenzie, and John Mari Pinkert. So for each of you, by way of introducing yourselves, your organizations, and what they do, can you talk about why you chose your current path or your current business or your social organization? Putting the pandemic and fiscal crisis aside for a moment, how do you generally see your work connecting to your personal, familial, community, or the city's development? And I guess, Rachel, if you can kick us off, please.
Hello, everyone. First, just thank you so much for having me. I'm also a New School alum, graduated from Milano, and my degree, I guess, is dated January 2020. So I'm really excited to be back. I really love this institution. So thank you, Latha, for inviting me. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow and assistant professor at NYU's Stern School of Business in the Management and Organizations Department. My research focuses on Black entrepreneurs and other BIPOC entrepreneurs, as well as Blacks in tech and innovation spaces. My dissertation work looked at the impact of the last Great Recession on Black entrepreneurs. And I got into doing this kind of work actually before I went back to graduate school full-time. I was working for a small kind of boutique consulting firm in Philadelphia, where I'm from. And we did some work with the Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity, helping them to revamp their office that dealt with minority and women-owned business set-aside programs. It was a similar office to what Raymond works, the kind of work that he does here in New York. And when I was doing that work, one of my tasks was to speak to folks around the country doing similar work in their offices. And most of the responses that I received from people doing this work was, well, we're trying to, revamp and improve. What are you all doing in Philadelphia? So it became pretty obvious to me that a lot of people were setting goals and few people were actually able to meet their goals. And it created all sorts of questions in my mind as to, what were the origins of the racial disparities that we were observing in entrepreneurship and other entrepreneur outcomes, and what can we do to close those gaps? And so those are the questions that I began sort of my graduate student career seeking to address, and I've been doing this work ever since.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction. And I guess if we can move on to Esmeralda, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Esmeralda Herrera. I'm Director of Programs and Community Relations at Communitas America, which is a nonprofit with a mission to support social impact ecosystem in under-resourced community. And our current focus is in the Boogie Down Bronx, where I was born and raised all my life. So we currently support ecosystem in two major ways, and one being our Social Impact Accelerator program, which runs twice a year, 3-month curriculum packed with speakers, templates, and a chance to win small grants of $10,000, $5,000 that entrepreneurs can can use toward their business however they seem fit. Many of our entrepreneurs who go through our program are Black and Latino entrepreneurs from the Bronx, from Harlem, from Queens, and so this topic is very important to us in the work that we do. Now, another very important solution that we do as an organization is also our innovation hub, which is called Hayground, which provides and will provide low-cost office spaces to entrepreneurs, but also really a space for collaboration and innovation. And for me, growing up in the Bronx and seeing, I think, a lot of gaps, right? There isn't always so much resources to be an entrepreneur. And if you are, then it's limited maybe to a brick and mortar, right? Which are great and are necessary as well. But how can we expand that definition and allow for many folks who are BIPOC to be a part of that and create that solution? And so for me, I think seeing my own community members be thought leaders to revitalize our local economy is what I feel really passionate about.
Thank you for that. Noel.
Yes, thank you. So happy to be here. I'm also an alum of the New School, 2013 graduate from Milano Nonprofit Management. And I think that my story kind of starts on two sides, and it starts before me, both of my grandmothers. So on the paternal side, my grandmother, Miss Phil, moved to Brooklyn in the 70s from Jamaica. And my dad actually moved a couple years later. And on the maternal side, that same time, my grandmother, Miss Nesta, she was actually moving from Jamaica to Albany, New York. So she actually got sponsorship to work on the property of Kenwood Academy. It was a convent that was part of a school that used to be a boarding school. And then somewhere in the 70s, they merged and became a private school, day school, whatever. But my grandmother worked there for 20 years. And then my mother worked there for 30 years. And because she worked there, both me and my sister actually got to attend this Protestant Catholic merged private school in Albany, New York, where I was freezing. But one of the things about it was the curriculum was that community service was a part of the day-to-day from the time that I was 8. So I came out of high school knowing two things. One, I wanted to get warm. So I went to Atlanta. And secondly, that I was supposed to be in mission-driven social impact work. And I'll never forget when I was in undergrad, one of my first opportunities to really do this. I've been doing Habitat for Humanity, signing up for volunteers, but the first one to offer my expertise as a leader was when I got an internship in South Africa. And so I went, and it was this really well-renowned NGO, projects for street children. And I'll never forget the day that the board chair comes to visit, and it's like your typical, if you think of a nonprofit, like understaffed, under-resourced, stressed out. And so when the board chair is coming, the executive director is like, we got to clean up. We got to make sure we're looking good. We got to, my boss is coming. So it's a big deal. Okay, you're all right, great. We're cleaning up, we're doing all these things. And then the board chair comes in, and I'll never forget, she comes in, she walks in, she shakes everyone's hand, acknowledges every single person in the room for their help, interns, staff, etc., except for me. I'm the only person she doesn't talk to. I'm the only one she doesn't look at. I'm the only one she doesn't acknowledge at an NGO that serves 100% people of color. So I'm here thinking, she either thinks that, I'm one of the boys, one of the street children that they're here to support. And if that is the case, that means you still wouldn't talk to me. And so I knew right then that, okay, there's something here to be said about what role folks who are getting helped get to play in being the one that helped, and what is blocking them from that. And then I came to the New School to try to refine my kind of quest for this. And I'll say I saw the same thing in my classrooms. We were talking about the Black and Brown community, under-resourced communities, and it wasn't represented in the classroom. Like, who gets to have a say? So that's why I founded Represented Foundation in 2017. It's a nonprofit based in Brooklyn. We're specifically helping Black and Latinx social entrepreneurs gain access into the social impact industry. Our work mirrors a lot of what Esmeralda was talking about. We do an incubator as well. VER, Vision Execution Results, and we're basically curating a community around Black and Latinx social entrepreneurs so they can have the confidence, the resources, and the connections to get inside the field so that no one ignores them ever again. We're actually, our applications are now open for that for the incubator. So if anyone's looking, we're definitely here to help for that. So yeah, that's me, why I got in the work and why I stay in the work.
Thank you, Noel, and definitely seeing a thread here in access, not just access, but access and support in a way that's going to be sustainable. So thank you for sharing that. And then John Marie.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Mari Pinkert. I'm a native New Yorker, Queens bound, Queens native, sorry. And I am the CEO and co-founder of the Hella Cocktail Company. We create all the bar accoutrement that's not the spirit across, we sell to bars, restaurants, retail stores, airlines, hotels, et cetera. We have tons of fun and experiences, but the reason I got into for-profit business was primarily out of freedom to represent my values through my brand and through my products, with continuing to be authentic to myself. I also was inspired from growing up in New York, right? I lived in Queens, and over the bridge was Manhattan, and you can see the tall buildings, but you never understood how the machine worked, right? Like why the resources went there, why everything looked shiny across the river. And so one of my missions was to figure out how things worked, right? And so that took me on a quick journey to the University of Virginia, where I got my bachelor's degree, and then to University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School of Business, where I got my MBA before starting my business, because I wanted to learn and more importantly, pay forward blueprint. And so I'm here in the hopes that I can help map out what it takes, what it looks like, what the resources are, and allow others to copy and paste the experiences that I've been able to and afforded to experience and show blueprint.
Thank you so much, Jamari, and very honored to be able to talk with all of you today. As we look at I guess two points or two sort of related items I want to kind of bring together here. One, MWBEs and other small businesses are noted as being significantly more likely to invest or reinvest in their communities. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about why you think that is, and if you think there's a connection to your identity as a BIPOC entrepreneur and the way that you engage community. I heard a little bit of that in your introductions, but I'm just trying to understand a little bit better your personal connections to your not just your organization's missions, but your employees and the communities that you work in, and then we can sort of move into your response to the pandemic, which I think we're sort of seeing the need as a city to pull together and draw on the foundations of what folks like you do.
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump right in. So I think, entrepreneurship is a lonely road to begin with. And I think an even lonelier road as a BIPOC entrepreneur. And so I think when many women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color begin reaching success and paving that way, there's this sense of like, we got to uplift as we climb mentality. And for us as Communitas America, we've really seen that in our entrepreneurs. And there's even someone in the attendees, Constance, I see you, where we held entrepreneur roundtable, and many of our entrepreneurs who may have not known each other prior met, and out of that came this Hey Girl collective. And so what they've described to me is like, yeah, we need one another, right? Because like, who else am I going to talk to this about? And so that's just something that came initially to mind as your words said, like, well, why do people want to reinvest? Well, I think it's a lonely road. And when you find companions, right, along the road, then you want to kind of give that back to the community, because you've finally start paving that success.
And I think I'll add to that, that community, when we talk about entrepreneurs of color, I think that community is so much a part of our DNA as people of color. And so if I use I'm going to use like a real flipped metaphor real quick. If we use the picture of what we saw a couple of weeks ago happen at the Capitol, for example. And I remember one of the things that I was seeing as I watched that go down is like, why don't, as I saw the majority of this crowd being white, I thought, why aren't other white people grabbing them and like stopping them? You know, why aren't other like white people being like, what are you doing? Come back here. Because I think that for better or worse, in communities of color, that is a little bit of a norm. You know, like someone will kind of check you if you're acting up, but on the flip side, they'll be the first ones to celebrate and congratulate with you when you win. And so we like to see each other win. And so when we do become entrepreneurs, when we are in business, why not continue to keep seeing each other win by investing into each other already? Like it's a part of our DNA, community building into one another. So yeah, that's what I kind of thought about when you first asked the question. Well, like community is kind of what we do.
Thank you for that. And Jamari.
I think that community also is creation, right? So we create so many things in the community. Whatever is cool 5 years from now in the world starts in small communities. And so community is part of how content and how things move forward and culture moves forward. And so I think it's core to the fundamentals of who we are, like Noel said, but it's also core to how things move and cycle through our ecosystem, right? Whether it's financial or cultural, like those are how those things are made. And the real question for us is how do we maximize the value that we continue to create? Usually we are not really good at that or versed at that because of things we're going to talk about, lack of resource, education, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not really the best right now at monetizing and extracting the value from the community that we are and the content we create out of it. So for me, it's a lot about how to harness it, how to showcase it, how to make sure we understand that it's valuable, and then how to utilize that value to the best of our ability.
Thank you. And thank you for those responses. Can we pivot from there and talk about beyond how BIPOC entrepreneurs can engage with community and how they orient around community is what we do. How did that translate into each of your organization's responses to the pandemic and the fiscal crisis? If you can talk a bit about how that response manifests in employee relationships or how the access, resources, strategies, Jamari, that you just talked about, how those and gaps there informed your response.
I'm happy to jump in if that's okay. I mean, for us, you know, we don't cure cancer over here at Helicopter Company. We provide, you know, tools for leisure, right? And so what we do know is that there are tons of constituent stakeholders that we do, you know, sell products to and support in the form of education and hospitality, bars, restaurants, namely in this moment, that are having a tough time. And so for us, you know, one of our brand pillars is giving. And very, very poignantly, we did, you know, a ton of silent auctions and charity events and things like that that we've done for the entire life of the company. But when COVID happened, we said, okay, how do we really channel our giving strategy? And what we did is we said, okay, let's go back to the people who've supported us along our journey, the bartenders and restaurateurs, and go back and support them monetarily. And so we started paying people for virtual shifts to teach the rest of our community how to do what they do for a living, right? Because there's value in it, and we're like kind of this middleman in this moment. And so one of the things that we did, we just truly, you know, lean into our giving vertical and really optimize and figure out a way to do that so everyone can see, number one, that we're about our word, but two, to show blueprint of how others can do it if they felt like this was something they had excess capital to do.
I can hop in. I think top down, if I think of, stakeholders for myself, my nonprofit, I think that the first thing I had to do, I remember very vividly, was this idea of the image of putting my own oxygen mask on. Middle of pandemic, so much is going on. What do I need? What do I need to be okay? And so mental health was a big part of that, making sure I found someone I could be regularly speaking to. Like, that was a top priority for me. And then moving down, I had to make sure that the same thing was the case for my team. And so even though I have like a small team and they're both contractors, made sure that, okay, great. Now, if you guys would like to, or if you're already seeking some type of, mental health therapy or treatment, I can reimburse you for that. So, making sure that like they had that room as well. And then understanding the third, if we go down further, the Black and Brown social entrepreneurs that we serve, not only because of the work that they do, which is ingrained in, disparities of every regard, access to food, to housing, to legal support services that were really only exacerbated by the pandemic, their work was now even more prevalent, even more important. And so we had to kind of pivot to make sure that we could do trainings and sessions online, virtually, so that they can still get the support they need, still get the training, and still meet in that regard. And then we opened it up. We actually started holding intention dinners, which was just opportunities for people to come together. We would be sponsoring Black or Brown-owned restaurants, because we knew that those were the ones suffering at that time. And really just have an open space for people to come together, communicate, and not have to, as many of them were doing, show up without the hurt that they were going through, show up without, any of the emotions that they were feeling that their jobs were kind of asking of them. So we just provided that space for people to come as you were. And yeah, so those were kind of the things that we pivoted right when the pandemic started.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about things like access to capital a little bit later, but I'm seeing how to a certain extent, at least in your organization, and I know in some of our other conversations I heard from Jamari and Esmeralda and yours, that you guys have used community as a resource where you might not have had like disposable income to spend on resources, maybe physical resources, that you've leveraged community as a resource, and so I want to name that and honor that. I think that's so critical.
Yeah, if I may add, for us, we really believe, right, revitalizing local economy. And I think that's why so many MWE are reinvesting. We get to finally say how our community looks, right? We get to say we're going to come in and build this, right? And yes, this is like a long-term vision, but this is like the short-term actions we got to do to reinvest, right? Make it look the way we want to feel, so that it has our values, right? The simple fact of having like a statue honoring Puerto Rico in front of our Hayground building means something to those who are living there. And so that's what it means, like reinvesting in our communities, and why people want to do it. Now you have more control of where you live and how you live, and there's not someone else like coming in and dissecting and saying, you know what, I think you actually need this. You got to get rid of all of this along Jerome Avenue. And that's what it is. And I think that really aligns with the work that we want to do and why we believe in giving out these small grants, right? Because there is limited access to capital. And sometimes you can get all the mentorship you need, and that's so crucial, but you might just need a little bit of funding to get you to that next idea, because we may be limited. And so for us as Communitize America, we also, in spirit of, COVID and trying to support many of our entrepreneurs, obviously going digital, but thinking about how would marketing play a part to these entrepreneurs in an oversaturated social media space? How can they really, put out what they're doing and get to not just sell their services and products, but create the social impact that I think for us, we feel passionate about.
Thank you for that. And I want to sort of go from that, because I've heard access to capital come up a couple of times, and wanted to sort of dig in on that a little bit, because I think as we look at, the recovery, and B, the opportunity represented by Rebuilding New York, that your access to capital, your organizational structure, your back office support, your equity investment, depending upon what kind of organization you're working with, all of those feed into your ability to respond to both opportunities and threats. And so I wanted to maybe, Rachel, if you'd like to sound off, just talk about the role of access to capital and the sort of what that looks like for minority-owned firms, for BIPOC entrepreneurs, as well as what sort of what alternatives there are to traditional banking relationships that don't seem to yield in the same way as they do for other firms or organizations.
Sure. Well, just looking at the body of research on various groups in that BIPOC category, one of the things you'll notice is that access to capital explains the vast majority of the disparities we observe in both rates of entrepreneurship and outcomes among entrepreneurs. It's a very long literature that details some of the reasons behind that. The racial wealth gap is one of the big ones. It's more difficult to fund your new venture or provide working capital to your venture from your own pocket if your pockets are smaller. Also, when it comes to things like a round of initial funding from friends and family, if your social network also doesn't have the same amount of capital as your sort of majority culture counterparts, that's another reason why we observe some of these disparities. And then the ability to leverage your assets to gain capital from commercial sources, like obviously commercial retail banks and so on. There's a long literature showing discrimination in various ways, whether there's a recent study actually looking at the PPP loan program. Some folks were doing audits of retail banks in the DC area. They sent 2 testers, one black, one white, to various retail bank locations to see how they were treated. And be surprising to some, but probably not surprising to most people on this webinar, there were very large differences in how the retail banks treated the customers, ranging everything from requiring more documentation for the black tester. Some of the questions they were asked were just actually illegal based off of our, fair lending, I forget the piece of legislation, but instances where the black tester was asked about their marital status and has to provide, financial information on their spouse. And these things aren't even legal and in terms of how you're supposed to, conduct the lending process. So we're facing a lot of issues with access to capital. One role of policy, though, I can say we have a paper just out up on SSRN this week where we examined access to the PPP program among Black entrepreneurs. And one of the things that we find, which is kind of encouraging actually, is that round 2 of the PPP program saw a lot smaller disparities. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that they changed aspects of the way the program was administered. So the first round, essentially, for all sorts of reasons, the main folks who were providing loans through the program were your big commercial banks. And due to a lot of factors, a lot of Black and BIPOC entrepreneurs don't have the existing relationships with those large banks. The way that they chose to administer it, it was a lot more convenient for those banks to lend to existing customers. There was some incentive, right? You don't want your existing customers to go under, so you have a greater incentive to lend to them as opposed to someone that doesn't have their deposits with you. But what they did for the second round, among other things, was they increased the types of SBA approved lenders that could receive, for example, funding through some of the things that the Fed set up. They had more access to capital that they could then lend to BIPOC entrepreneurs. And FinTech actually got involved as well. And there's a paper that is out that shows specifically looking at the program that sort of the discriminatory lending that you observe in banks was a lot lower when it came to the activity of some of these fintechs, and they argue that their processes are more automated. There's less room for sort of human biases in the process, and so that's the reason why they believe that they've observed less discrimination there. But this is a sort of new territory. I'm not saying that fintech doesn't discriminate and brick and mortar or traditional banks do, but I do think it is potentially an area of opportunity for us to think about new ways that we can structure capital access to entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jamari, can you talk a bit about, and Noel as well, I'm curious from your organizations being, one, a social entrepreneurship, the other sort of a business entrepreneurship model, how you're looking at access to either capital or grants, investments that fuel your work, and how you anticipate those to either how you've seen them change and how you anticipate you'll need to pivot as we move forward into the next year. And,
I'll talk. I'll go. I think listening to, I'm trying to draw from a little, some either points of experience or relation to what Rachel was just saying. And one thing that I think about is larger, maybe institutions and longer history, more capital. I'm thinking about philanthropic institutions, or maybe a larger organizations that have a system of giving or investing, but simply they have a standing for it. I think that maybe I'll speak specifically in the philanthropic world. The larger they are, they tend to have a particular vision of what success looks like, or a point where they are ready to invest. And a larger organization, whatever it is, when it comes to finances, you have more controls in place. Before we invest with someone or donate to someone over X amount of money, we do an internal audit. We do a whatever, all these barriers that go through, and it's to protect themselves, but that should happen when it's larger. And so getting to the point, getting in those doors is a challenge, one, when you're newer, smaller, younger, less connected, and then being taken as legitimate, also harder because of these biases that exist. You exist outside of that. And so last night, actually, in our incubator, we had a session that was all about elevator pitch. And Precious Williams, shout out to Precious Williams, pitchmaster, told our cohort, when you are playing by a game where the rules are set against you, when you're in a no-win scenario, you have to play outside of the rules. And so I can say for me personally, when we were trying to gain funding and gain respect from the institutions, organizations that have a history of funding minority entrepreneurs, minority social entrepreneurs, I would break down barriers, use all the networks I have, pull all the strings to get in the room, and they would look at me and look at our business, and it didn't look like their model for success. It did not look like what the foundation is used to giving money to. So I had to go somewhere else. I had to step outside of the philanthropic world and find young, excited corporate partners who believed in the vision, who saw excitement behind this and didn't have all the yellow tape or a block in their mind about what success looked like. So that idea of when the rules are written against you, you have to write your own. I think that is what I am seeing as working. That's what's worked personally for us. And part of what we try to explain and show the Black women entrepreneurs that we work with.
Thank you for that.
I'd like to piggyback right on that, because that's where I was going, and you kind of you created a nice driveway for me. What you're seeing when these rules are not created for you, and the model doesn't work for the powers that be, what you're seeing pop up is a lot of these entrepreneurial crowdfunding sites, right? And so this is the way that you think about, when you think about community doesn't have to always just be a physical location. It can be a behavioral mindset. And so these communities that are funding this content and this creation of new ideas, for us and for a lot of other companies in spaces that are like ours, you're finding these crowdsourcing equity platforms, right? And so you can go in there, explain your whole narrative, and then talk directly to that behavioral community and say, let's, for instance, say we don't believe in drinking. We don't drink. This non-drinking community, this sober, curious community is all about this product or this idea. Please help us raise money to then solve the issue that we're solving for, which is the lack of XYZ. And so this is what we're seeing a lot of it. I think Kickstarter was kind of like the first iteration of this a while back, but now you're seeing it get really, really serious with like, you know, term sheets and kind of the bells and whistles that banks and other investors would require. And it's becoming a lot more structured. So I think that this is going to become some more and more of the new norm of how community building from a physical standpoint and a behavioral standpoint starts to work from a for-profit and not-for-profit business.
Thank you guys so much. Yeah, I'm looking at the access to capital piece. I'm remembering one of our and the pivot that you're talking about here, where you're switching where you're looking for that capital, and I think that's a critical step. Curious to know what you all's experience, and this may be more for Noel and Esmeralda, but Rachel, I think you can talk to this too. What your experience of government grants is, and if you see any barriers or if you see inequitable access on that front, and what pivots or what proposals you might have that would broaden your access to those grants or funding pools.
As Esmeralda thinks, do you have it? Okay. As I'll think about one thing in particular I'm passionate and interested in is we're all, you know, some of us are here. I think we're all in New York, actually. Yeah, great. So we're all here in New York, and one of the initiatives that exist for minority entrepreneurs is the MWBE certification, Minority Women Business Enterprise certification. And I think it's like a really fantastic idea and opportunity. And, you know, there's extra, I'm dumbing it down, but for those who don't know, it's like extra incentive care when there are contract opportunities. If you have the certification, some of those folks who are holding the contracts, whether they be with the city, you know, or a public entity, great. Do you have MWBE certification first? We'd love to know if we're interacting with a minority-owned business or enterprise. When I think about social entrepreneurs who, I've said this in earlier conversations with this group, is that like the thing about distinguishes someone who's creating a nonprofit, for instance, or a for-profit, is just your legal structure. So the sense to say, I do not own it outright. It is, you know, a community, but we still have the same idea of a mission that we're attached to, stakeholders that we have to abide by, et cetera, et cetera. And those who create nonprofits aren't even included in this certification, MWBE certification. If you're creating a nonprofit, then, you know, you're not part of this conversation. And there's also, there is no equivalent for Black and brown social entrepreneurs or nonprofit founders who are likewise doing a business that they want to provide a service and simply just have this legal structure which says I can also accept donations, or, you know, we also have community focus. Mm-hmm. I think it's important. I thought about this a little bit more because driving the point home that the only distinction is this legal structure. Some of the largest, most successful nonprofits that we may know of are FIFA, for example, the NFL, the New School, you know, and so really the only thing that distinguishes, like I said, is just this legal structure. And so there's this whole demographic of people who wants to do good, but also do economically well for themselves and their community, but they don't have support for it. So I would love for that to become some type of policy within the city, like, hey, we also have support or include nonprofit founders in this case of support and care when it comes to, you know, MWBE certification and extra support.
Mhm.
That's one I think about.
There's an additional level of cultural fluency that often comes with that as well, especially if you're talking about direct service to communities. So point well taken, and thank you for sharing that. Esmeralda, I think I saw you unmute.
Yeah, no, I think I want to piggy off of what Noel said and add some additional points because, you know, it's true. We tend to think of businesses as very just binary. Like you're either doing good or you're either making money. And I think we should start looking at the intersectionality, right? Which is what we do, social entrepreneurship, which doesn't always fall as just a nonprofit or just a for-profit. I think there are so many ways to look at legal structures to play a part of what you can do, right? And I think for the MWBE certification, by broadening that, then we start actually looking at what our communities need. Our communities need not just funding or, you know, to have a good job that's doing well or one business is doing well. We want our businesses to do well, but also have an impact in the community that they're essentially, you know, getting money from. And that's okay, right? We all need sustainability in our lives, but we also need to think about, well, what are we doing? And so I just piggy off of what Noel said there. And then what I would add in is the MWBE certification, right? And this is just one, right, of the government initiatives that we see can go from, you can get yours from like 2 weeks all the way to 2 years. So what are the gaps there? And it goes back into like yellow tape and what we see in capital, right? When you're accessing, there's so much paperwork, and I'm not saying let's not have that. I get that. That's what we need, but it's more of like, well, for our organization, we want to limit that yellow tape. We want you to be informed, right? And so we want you to think about all of this even as you're creating your business. And so, for example, we'll talk about venture capital in our accelerator program, which may not be applicable for everybody that's there, but at least they have the knowledge and they can make the decision for themselves to go down this route, right? So I think having more organizations that the governments can really invest in so that we can do a little bit of that hand holding. Again, not every entrepreneur needs that. Some may need it just at the beginning, some may need it in the middle, and some may need it at the end. But at least the government is saying, you know what, we not only created the certification, we're making it accessible enough so people could do it. And we're not creating gatekeepers, right? We're creating templates so that you could do it on your own if you wanted to. So those are some of the immediate things that come to mind.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, definitely happy to share. Speaking from the inside of that process, I know a lot has been done to move the process online and streamline it to shorten the amount of time. And I'm seeing a note in the chat. Constance, please feel free to reach out, and happy to try to connect you as possible to folks who can maybe help you with that particular issue. Coming out of the conversation around sort of alternate funding, it sort of introduces the concept of alternate business models. And I'm curious if we can talk, as we sort of close out the panel portion, a little bit about what some of those alternate models might look like and how they might support the city's recovery, but also equitable participation in the economy and economic justice. Hearing both of you talk, I couldn't help but think about like B Corps. I couldn't help but think about worker ownership models. And I'm wondering if you guys see what your thoughts are about those sort of vehicles from the perspective of your academic study, your particular organizations.
I wanted to sort of jump in, bridging the last question and this new question also. This came up when we had a conversation before. So I just wanted to acknowledge a distinction and just sort of almost raise a question. Because in addition to the sort of legal distinctions, there is this idea of ownership when we're thinking about nonprofit social enterprises versus for-profit social enterprises. And one of the other areas of work that I've done and been involved in is this idea of how do we close the racial wealth gap? And so owning the means of production and having that sort of register as, a way that individuals increase their personal wealth or the wealth for their families and their households, I think is another reason behind making sure that we extend access to opportunity for minority and women-owned businesses. I hope that we could have something similar for nonprofit entities that acknowledges, the unique barriers that those who operate nonprofits who are part of the BIPOC community face. But I think it's worth exploring this question about, if we have this alternative way of thinking about ownership, how does that relate to other conversations about wealth disparities? If we're thinking about models that don't emphasize as much individual ownership of entities or ownership of the means of production, how does that also interact with our goals to close wealth gaps if the community that already owns most of the assets isn't also having that same sort of mindset and they're just continuing to amass wealth? So I think it's a question that we should be thinking about, what shared wealth looks like in our communities. As far as the funding, another aspect of that, I think that could be really important in this conversation is sort of ethnic-owned banks. Something that we used to talk a lot more about it in the context of some of the Asian-owned enterprises. I was recently looking at the work from Tamara Nakper, who looks at Korean businesses and just the role that sort of Korean-owned banks, both overseas and here, play in extending opportunities for that community, and the fact that those banks are sort of well integrated in the SBA funding system. So they're able to tap into those federal resources and leverage them along with private capital that comes from, quite frankly, overseas to fund Korean-owned enterprises in the US. And I just wonder what models like that could look like for other communities of color as well.
Yeah, we need B Corps, really do. And what I would say to that is that here in the Bronx, folks tend to think, oh, we're not making a lot of money. Oh, there's a lot of money in this borough. And I won't name any organizations, but think about what organizations actually live here in the Bronx if you wanted to be a tourist and come visit. What are some tourist spots that you could really be going to? So that means money is coming in, but it's not staying. And so what does that mean for the people who actually live here? And so I want to tie that back into like community. So we talked about community in the beginning, right? Well, we need these organizations that are saying, hey, we want to cultivate this sense of community, because guess what? We had our own entrepreneur, Darren Holman Jr. He said he created an app. The first 1,000 downloads will be coming from your friends and family. He's now at about 10,000 downloads in his app. So we know community matters. And so who's helping foster this community that then leads to these collaborations and coalitions that can lead to a shared asset holding, right? B Corps. And we have started to see that here in the Bronx a little bit, but I definitely think we need some more, and how we'll be able to do that depends on who has the ability to like learn all of this. So for sometimes we think, oh, entrepreneurship, it shouldn't be learned. You should kind of have it innate, but that's not fair. We say college, we teach college and do financial aid and hand walk people to college, which can or cannot lead to great jobs. So why can't we do the same when we think about entrepreneurship? Why can't we think, oh, these programs should be able to be alive to do a hand holding that will create like a better setting? But instead we think differently. We think, oh no, entrepreneurship should be this kind of like sacred thing, and you should kind of have your own innate thing or natural ability.
That's right. And I think that ties into that neoliberal model of like a merit-based system, but it's only merit-based if you're at the bottom scrambling to get a piece, not if you're like, a large multinational corporation or part of the ruling class, in which case it's like, here you go, there's a path. As Jamari says, there's your driveway, you know, like just take it straight to the mansion. So thank you for that, Esmeralda. I think we're going to start to close the panel and shift to Q&A. But I just wanted to end, if I could, the panel on the note of values that Esmeralda brought up, and that I think has pervaded the conversation pretty much from beginning to end, to sort of building off of values are choices. And I think both for us as folks who are in this work, and for the folks who are watching and who may download and watch, choices are a big part of what's going to fuel New York City's recovery post-COVID, and the place that MBEs and MWBs will have in that recovery. I'm not speaking at like a city agency or administration level so much, but at the consumer level, the partnership level, like how you vote, where you buy things, who you grant to, you know, how you staff your organization or your board. All of those things are what's going to shape New York City's recovery from COVID and move us from restoring to truly rebuilding. And I think that's a main focus for us in this panel, and very curious for your questions as we wind down. I want to give my panelists like one last thought, if anybody has a burning thought that you want to share.
Perfect. I did. And I was like, no. It's coming and adding on the last 2 points that we've been going back and forth with, but it's a belief that I have that we cannot be what we cannot see. And so the reason why I think that, like, when it comes to B Corps, which is another type of certification, I think that publicly we get to see one viewpoint of what success looks like. And it's real binary, you know, to succeed, you're supposed to look like this. But I think that to know that you can be successful in 1,000 different ways, you just need to see an example of that to figure out which one is the one that you're supposed to emulate and then reiterate that really works for yourself. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to, like, you know, B Corps, just using them as an example, I think that an entrepreneur would need the opportunity to see what that is, why that might work for them, and why that might be the route for them to go, as well as someone else needs to see a successful example of a C Corp or an S Corp or a nonprofit or the worker owner model. Like, we literally need to see the myriad of all of these examples to know that all of them are valid, all of them are like have the opportunity for you to get success in that. It's not just a one track route for success.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
And that to me is about controlling your own narrative, right? We need to tell our stories and show people that these things exist and how they exist, right? To applaud them when they do well or when they're in process of doing it. Like, show how it works so that we can see that it's true, and then you get to choose. But if we can't see it and we don't control that story, and we're only talking about Uber buying so-and-so or whatever the big companies are, then we think that's the only way that it works. And so we have to do a really good job and better job of showcasing our process in discovery through the journey.
I want to sort of build off of that into the Q&A. The first question, I think, talks to I think we've started to answer that question, which is, how do you define entrepreneurship? Is it a mindset, an attitude in life? Is it important to tie up to the community, not only in transactional way, but give and take, and through peer supporting? And I think we're beginning to talk about that. It's really a fingerprint. And I think I talked a little bit at the beginning about entrepreneurship. If you're part of a large organization where you don't have as much control over the direction of the organization, you do have impact over the how the organization does the thing that it does. And so I think in situations like that, it can be more of a mindset. I want to invite our panelists to sound off on that question as well. Oh, Noel, you're muted. It looked like you were talking. Sorry, now you are.
I was just like kind of reading the question to myself, and then I was like, how do you define entrepreneurship? Yeah. So I was it was going through it in that sense, I think, because it bleeds into all of those things. You know, Career, absolutely, you know, how you provide for yourself. But it definitely becomes more way of life and mindset, both in seeing opportunity, seeing possibility, and then in whatever, in like your day-to-day in your life, and then following up on that in like a real give it your best effort, and then it might completely fail, and then you move on. You know, like, so that is why I can say, like, as an aspect of, and then what did you learn from it? Like of a mindset, of a way of life for entrepreneurship. And then I think, let's see, was the other part of the question there? It was talking about, is there a way to systematize? Oh no, I'm looking at the wrong one.
Is it important to tie up to the community, not only in a transactional way, but give and take?
That one. Yeah. So one of the cool things about entrepreneurship is that, to Jamori's point, defining the narrative. And so you get to define not only your problem, but your solution and your measured success and who your community is. You know, you get to define all of those things. And no matter what you define, I think, like, if you're a person of color, I say, like, great, we need you, you know? But if you don't have those things, especially like who are you serving? Who are your people? Who is your community? Mm-hmm. That you take with you, you know? And so if you say that one year and you lose it the next, really you've lost the foundation of your business. And really, like, you know, that would also say a lot about, like, who you are, and not necessarily the best way, about like what type of business you have. So this idea of, and again, you define how you do it and who it is, but yeah, you absolutely have to have a community, like a true tribe about your business as it grows, as it moves, you know, to sustain you.
Thank you. Jamari.
Exactly. I think to add to it, it's an evolving cycle. So the true entrepreneur does it over and over and over, right? Like they understand community, they grab the insight, they turn it into data and product and content to deploy, right? They understand that, did it work or not? They share their goals that are ascertained and built into it, and then they share it with the community and say, this is how I did it. And then you evolve because things have changed as you listen to your constituents, you have new knowledge and you do it again. And this may be the same product, it may be a different business, and maybe a social component, it may be all together, but because you're listening to the community, you start to understand the insights that become more and more important. And so I think while some companies don't initially build community into it, it's always there. And so you can choose to, like, call it out and say, this is why I'm doing it, or this is the benefit or not, but the evolution of that cycle happening is what I believe an entrepreneur is really good at. Mm.
Yeah, and I really want to add is that, you know, I believe that entrepreneurs are analyzing a problem. So let's say you are, you've created your nonprofit, right? You've analyzed a problem, and now you're producing something that causes systematic change. Yes, in regular business, there are clone markets, right? So if you make something and that could be successful, but I want to acknowledge your question, because it is beyond that. It allows a whole community to take part in this road of entrepreneurship for those that are monetizing it and those that are trying to make the social impact. So a social entrepreneur, you analyze a problem and you create a systematized social solution to it. It can happen in the government level, right? It can happen in the brick and mortar level. But when we think about that as a community sense, right, and how we're measuring what we're creating and how it affects the community, then we can all start to be exactly what Ray talked about, right, an intrapreneur. We start to look closely at our social media and say, okay, who am I sponsoring today? And who am I liking today? That leads into higher, right, like how we affect overall businesses. And so I do want to acknowledge that, because we focused here today on entrepreneurship, right? And how the roles of entrepreneur can play a part in the recovery of post-COVID. But I think every individual here in this room plays a part in that, right? It's who you decide to purchase. And yes, sometimes that's out of our control because maybe we don't have a lot of funding on this particular day or this month, and we need to go with something that's cheaper, and it ends up being a bigger factory or something like that, which are not bad because we do have MWBEs, people in those roles too. And I want to kind of acknowledge that they exist because we need to tell their story, but they may not be many. So yes, we're all a part of that process in analyzing the problem and working toward that solution.
Thank you all for that answer. And I wanted to hold up something that Jamari said in one of our conversations when we were talking about the response to COVID. I kind of playfully posted the Webster definition of entrepreneur as part of the invite, in part to stimulate thoughts about what entrepreneurship is. And I appreciate that we're having that conversation now. It seems to focus a lot on managing and assuming risk, organizing, managing, and assuming risk. And I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, to hold up Jamari's statement during one of our conversations around, and I apologize for the siren in the background, that really MWBEs and MBEs in particular, BIPOC entrepreneurs, live from a place of the pivot, the hustle, if you will, I think was the word, Jamari, that you used. And so when you have an obstacle like COVID and the associated economic crisis, that it's in your DNA, and we've talked about DNA a bit on this panel, to pivot, right? And so how do we manage risk? Well, managing risk is part of daily life to a certain degree. And I wanted to just hold that up because I think that's critical as we look at new challenges. How do we do that on a systemic level? How do we do that on a structural level? And who do, how do we vote? Who do we petition to act on our behalf in that regard? I want to go back to the Q&A and just bring up another several questions. If we can talk about, I thought this was a great question from Nam. What do you think about the role of community organizers in supporting the BIPOC and immigrant-owned businesses? Is there a way to systematize the collaboration between community organizations and those businesses?
I think immediately I'm like, yes, because I think that those are two demographics of leaders who can benefit so much from one another, in the sense to mean that as a community organizer, you still need certain things, like you still fund resources, support, whatever, like supplies. There are still things that you may need to go to get, and in that regard, on the flip side, like it's consumers, suppliers. So if you have aligned missions, we want to support the same community, even though it may be differently, then I would think that, again, like that's a perfect opportunity for professional relationships, professional partnerships to go to merge. And that's assuming that happens distinctly. So, I happen to think about one organization, the Black Chef Movement, who was, they're part of our current cohort of fellows right now, who have been there. Rashid is the nonprofit founder, creating a business, and has created a business out of supplying free food to protesters, demonstrators, so much of the movement, of the change that was going on in this past year. And so, to kind of your earlier point, Ray, like her and other folks understand there was a need. I'm diving right in to fit it. And then the entrepreneur mind shift is, great, now how do I shift what I've just done to continue to staying either relevant or to continue supporting? So there are instances where it's one and the same. You can be a community organizer and a business, an entrepreneur, or it can be, you can be a community organizer and partner with the right businesses, the right MWBE businesses that you need. Or you can be, an MWBE business that is like, part of your part of your strategy, part of your financial plan is to commit whatever, X amount of hours, resources, dollars, food to whatever movement you feel like is fueling and, speaking to your own community. So that kind of just makes me circle back to the folks really just need to be able to see more of these examples more readily so that they can depict which one is for them.
Something that came up for that question is, how do we systematize that? And it can be difficult, right? Because they cross over different, sometimes political thoughts and et cetera, et cetera. But I think about data. And the reason why I think about data is because sometimes we don't even get to control our own data, what's coming out of our communities and how we're being represented. But thinking about what community organizers, they have on the ground, their ear to the ground. And I think, yes, it feels scary to want to quantify that and think about that as just data, but that it will be helpful. And then you get to control it a little bit more because you get to speak on it and you get to share it properly. And I think that data that community organizers or activists could potentially gather would be phenomenally helpful to MWE businesses. And I think then there could create a link because those who are community organizing, they see the struggle firsthand. And then sometimes that leap, right, to purchase at a MWBE, we get to start to understand what that leap is, what that gap is, and that is the problem. So I do think we can systematize in a way that maybe we are not necessarily doing, that may feel kind of weird and insensitive, but again, like, how do we get to control our narrative and then use our own data to benefit within the community so that everybody gets to prosper?
I think we're on the similar wavelength, Esmeralda. I was going to talk about the role of technology a little bit. Some of the work that I'm getting more into is examining sort of racial equity issues in technology entrepreneurship in particular. And I'm really interested and anxious to see the role that technology can play in sort of bridging those gaps between information sharing, data gathering, and so on. And one of the things that I've noticed is sort of over time when we're thinking particularly about social movements is the difference that exists today versus, civil rights movement, for example, in the 1960s and so on, the role that institutions played back then versus now. And we don't have those same sorts of like strong shared institutional groundings that they did back then. And I wonder what it looks like to sort of dispersed. There are a lot of strengths to the way that our movements are kind of dispersed and leaderless in certain regards, but I think we also use a certain amount of like capacity and the benefits that come from sort of economies of scale by being so dispersed. And so I wonder what kind of technological solutions could potentially serve the role that those sorts of more people-oriented institutions played back then. Not only with sharing data, but also just creating platforms that people are going to be more intentional about the way they're consuming and who they're consuming from. How can digital platforms, I think Jamari was talking earlier about the way that some of these platforms emerge to help with non-traditional ways of acquiring equity financing, but how can we utilize some of these platforms just to increase people's awareness of BIPOC entrepreneurs that they can support and purchase from? And some of these have cropped up. The Buy Black, there have been a couple of these like Buy Black Now platforms, but they haven't taken off. This is a research question that I am actually in the process of figuring out how to tackle. But why have some been more successful than others, and why have they been less successful in sort of gaining the momentum that some of these other sorts of consumer platforms have been, and what can we do to sort of address, quite frankly, some of the stigmas people have around minority entrepreneurships and minority ventures. There's a certain amount of stigma in the sense that people don't view them as being as good of quality
Right.
And is there a way that we can sort of change people's perception with these kinds of technological solutions?
Yeah, thank you for flagging that culture shift that is undoing decades and probably hundreds of years of assumptions about the quality of the contribution that BIPOC people and entrepreneurs in particular bring to the table. And I think it's also, it talks to a certain degree of, again, going back to values. Are you valuing like speed and access? Do you want it delivered like 6 hours after you've ordered it? Or is it worth more to you to support a local business and have it delivered tomorrow or the day after? Like, do you really need the thing the way that you are accustomed to receiving the thing using more commercial avenues? And I think that, you know, looking at the sort of expanding web of relationships, we started with that question, like, how does your business touch your community, your city, you know, your employees? As folks, you know, are looking at the models, as Noel calls them, of doing business, there are models of supporting businesses as well. And I think people might not be aware of how much impact they can have with how they spend their dollars. So that's another consideration. I do want to like bring us to another question or two before we wrap up. There was a great question from Lohan, which I wanted to bring, which is following up on leveraging communities. Are there ways you think about community that may not be an obvious way to think about them? For example, do you have individuals that you've reached out to, partnered with in your journey that you did not consider a part of your community originally?
I'll say 100%. One, particularly coming from the nonprofit field, I think that volunteers get overlooked a lot, just the value of volunteers. And so it's just interesting, no matter what type of entrepreneur you are, if you are a person of color, if you're not coming from generational wealth, you're starting behind because you need a little bit of capital to begin your business. And but if you have the ability to invest or enroll other people in your vision, that means at least to begin, you can start tapping into their expertise, their manpower, their feedback, their hours, whatever have you. And so it helps you. It is a way of helping to equalize the capital, social capital inequity just a little bit. But then if you look at, again, thinking of, again, the nonprofit field, if we can think of organizations that are like Habitat for Humanity, imagine how many homes have been built because they tap into people who show up for 4 hours or 8 hours at a time and then walk away and homes are built. So while you don't necessarily have to go a full nonprofit route, when you think of, and Jamari was talking about you try something, iterate, and then reporting back to that community of, hey, here's what happened, here's what I learned. You as an entrepreneur, what happens is folks start to respond to that. And then folks start to say, oh, I heard about you from X and X, or I've been following for a while. Now, how can I help? Now, how can I support? Now I want to buy. Now I want, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, there's this idea of, I really think about whether you're a traditional nonprofit or not, this idea of really valuing and leveraging the free support, the free help, the donated hours, expertise, time, et cetera, resources, especially when you don't have and you have somewhere big to go. Like, I think that can't be, it's an invaluable asset because it's limitless.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we are getting to our time. I'm sad. I thought it would be a long hour and a half, but it was like 5 minutes. So I'll look forward to more conversations with you all, and very grateful to Latha and to the New School for creating this opportunity for us to talk and for us to engage with the audience who had some excellent questions. So very grateful to you all for tuning in and for your thoughtfulness. Please consider looking up these folks who have joined me on the panel today, supporting their businesses or their missions. I think volunteering is a great call. I think also looking at all the opportunities for engagement that are in front of you, and you know, we look forward to rebuilding New York with you. Thank you so much. Latha, please.
Yeah, thank you for joining us in the panel. I think it was such an exciting event, especially to hear the ground lived reality. And some of you know that I'm an entrepreneur myself in the tech field, and I know how difficult it is. And when Esmeralda talked about it being a very lonely journey, that is so true. That it is a very lonely journey, and we really and we really need to not go it alone, right? We need the community to go with and travel with in this space, there were like a lot of great themes here and a lot of hopeful things too. The fact that Representative Foundation and Communities Americas exist today, and people driving this kind of initiative and creating the space for community collaboration and peer network, and Jamari's yeah, I still have to try the cocktail, but to have also have different kinds of entrepreneurship, right? It doesn't mean just that if we are a person of color, we should only be running a nonprofit, and the attention drawn to also the wealth creation and the wealth gap, I think is very crucial, because our assumption is that if you are not from the mainstream group, then you should be doing something good by being a nonprofit. And I think that that's great for people that want to do that, but it's also great for people that want to pursue other avenues. And I really do think that, and I had shared on the chat that I think about Radical Health, which is like a health tech enterprise, is the first benefit corporation in New York City, which is, she's actually featured in one of my research projects, and I'm hoping to bring her onto a health tech panel next academic year. So with that said, this was great. Thank you very much for everybody for joining. And I'm pretty sure that, New York has always come out of difficult circumstances stronger, and we will continue to do that. My hope is that we also come out stronger, but also more just and more equitable and more inclusive in the recovery process. So I want to highlight the next event we have is actually next Wednesday, which explores the gap between espoused and institutional values in different industries, because we know that like DEI has exploded. A lot of organizations are putting out lots of statements and social media and things like that, but how much of it is like kind of check boxes, and how much of it is a lived reality, and how do we address the gap between this aspirational values, the espoused values, and the institutionalized or the lived values. And so it's going to be a really great session, so please join us. And we have another event actually the week after also, and which is on design and organizations. So it's going to be a great month for us, and join us back. And thank you, panel, and thank you everybody for joining, and looking forward to continuing this conversation and contributing in whatever way I can personally and as an institution from the New School. So thank you.